There's a car that saved a company, pulled it back from absolute ruin, kept thousands of workers employed, kept a name alive that could have vanished forever into the rubble of post-war Europe. And almost no one talks about it, not on the big TV shows, not in the coffee table books, not in the glossy magazines that celebrate motoring history. The journalists who cover classic cars will spend hours debating the Citroën DS, the Jaguar XK120, the Mercedes 300 SL. They'll argue about them like old friends argue about football. But the car that actually rebuilt one of France's greatest manufacturers, the one that came out of genuine devastation and quietly changed everything, it gets a paragraph, maybe two, and then the page turns. That car is the Peugeot 203, built from 1948 to 1960, 685,000 units produced. And today, most people under 60 have never heard its name. If you're watching this, you probably remember a time when cars meant something more than a screen on wheels. When engineering was honest, when a manufacturer had to earn your trust because there was no marketing department covering for bad decisions. You remember when reliable was the highest compliment you could give a machine. The Peugeot 203 was that car. And the story of how it came to exist is darker, more complicated, and more impressive than anyone has bothered to tell you. Because before there was a 203, there was a factory on fire. There were Allied bombs falling on French soil. There were choices being made by company men who had spent the war years in an impossible position, and who now had to decide whether to build something entirely new or simply give up. This is that story, and by the time we're done, you'll understand not just what made this car extraordinary, but why the world forgot it, and what that says about the way history actually works. Pay attention to this next part, because it starts not with a car, but with a war. The summer of 1944. The war in Europe is entering its final, brutal chapter. Allied forces are pushing through France, and the skies over the country are no longer safe for anyone. On the 25th of July, 1944, American bombers targeted the Peugeot factory in Sochaux, a town in eastern France, close to the Swiss border. A factory that had been, for most of the war, producing vehicles and components for the German military. Now, before you form an opinion about that, understand something. This was not unusual. Across occupied France, manufacturers were given a choice that wasn't really a choice. Cooperate with the occupiers or watch everything you built get dismantled and shipped to Germany anyway. Some resisted, some collaborated. Most tried to do both at once, keeping the factory running while quietly helping the underground where they could. Peugeot's situation was complicated. There is documented evidence that members of the Peugeot family made contact with British intelligence and actually invited the RAF to sabotage their own facilities, preferring targeted destruction to full occupation. Precision sabotage operations did take place, but by 1944, the Allies needed something faster and more complete. The bombing raid on Sochaux killed civilians. It destroyed production lines. It left the factory in a condition that would have justified any reasonable person simply walking away. And here is where the story turns. Most companies faced with that level of destruction would have spent years just restoring what existed before, rebuilding the old tooling, relaunching the old models, getting back to familiar ground as quickly as possible. Peugeot did not do that. The men who ran the company made a decision that in retrospect looks either visionary or slightly mad, possibly both. They decided that rather than resurrect what was destroyed, they would design something completely new, from the ground up. A car built not for the world that existed before the war, but for the world that was coming after it. That decision would take 4 years to become metal and glass and rubber on a road, But when it arrived as something Europe had not seen from a mainstream manufacturer before. And the engineering behind it, the real engineering, not the brochure version, is the part that will surprise you. But first, you need to understand just how empty Europe's roads actually were in 1948, because that context changes everything about why this car mattered. 1948. The war has been over for 3 years, but Europe doesn't feel like peace yet. Rationing is still in place across much of the continent. In Britain, bread rationing only ended in 1948. Bread, of all things, rationed after the war ended. France is rebuilding its infrastructure from scratch. Roads that were deliberately destroyed during the conflict, bridges that were blown, supply chains that simply ceased to exist. The average working man in France in 1948 did not own a car. He rode a bicycle, maybe a motorcycle if he was doing well. A car was a serious, almost gravity-defying purchase. Something that had to last, had to be maintained cheaply, had to run on roads that were sometimes little more than memory. This is the world Peugeot was designing for. And that context is absolutely critical, because when you understand what people actually needed in 1948, the engineering choices behind the 203 stop looking conservative and start looking like precision. Let's start with the body. The Peugeot 203 was built using full monocoque construction. What does that mean in plain terms? It means the body and the chassis are one single welded structure. There is no separate frame underneath with a body bolted on top. The whole car is one piece, stressed and reinforced throughout. This was not the standard approach in European mainstream cars at that time. Many manufacturers were still working with separate body-on-frame designs, older technology, heavier, less rigid. Peugeot looked at what aircraft engineers had been doing during the war years and applied the same thinking to a family car. The result was a vehicle that was lighter than it had any right to be, stiffer in the corners and more fuel efficient because it wasn't carrying dead weight around. Then there was the suspension, independent front suspension using a torsion bar, not coil springs, not leaf springs, a torsion bar. A long metal rod that twists under load and returns, absorbing bumps with a progressive, controlled feel. This gave the 203 a ride quality that competitors charging significantly more money could not match on the broken roads of post-war France. Pay attention to this now, because what Peugeot was doing was not flashy. There were no press conferences with dramatic unveilings, no famous designer's name attached to the bodywork. Just engineers solving real problems for real people with the best tools available to them. And the engine they put under that bonnet, that's where things get genuinely interesting, because the decisions made inside that 1948 engine bay would echo forward into automotive history in ways nobody anticipated. That part of the story is coming, and it's the part that changes how you see this car entirely. Let's talk about the engine, because this is where most people's understanding of the Peugeot 203 stops being casual and starts being genuinely uncomfortable in the best possible way. The 203 came fitted with a 1,290 cubic centimeter four-cylinder engine, overhead valves, cast iron block, 30 horsepower at 5,000 revolutions per minute. On paper, those numbers sound modest, ordinary even. But the architecture inside that engine was not ordinary at all. Peugeot's engineers designed the 203's combustion chambers in a hemispherical shape, a dome, and if you know anything about internal combustion engines, that word should make you sit up slightly straighter. Here is why it matters. A hemispherical combustion chamber places the intake and exhaust valves on opposite sides of the dome, angled toward each other. This geometry allows larger valves, better airflow in and out of the cylinder, and a more complete burn of the fuel-air mixture. More complete burn means more power extracted from the same amount of fuel. It means less waste. It means the engine breathes better at higher revs than a flathead or bathtub design could manage. This concept, refined and expanded, would later become the defining engineering signature of American muscle car engines in the 1960s. Chrysler would build an entire performance legacy around what they called the Hemi engine. It became the stuff of legend on drag strips and racetracks across the United States. But a version of that same thinking was already sitting quietly under the bonnet of a modest French family car in 1948. Built for school teachers and small business owners and country doctors navigating unpaved roads outside Lyon. That's not a footnote. That's a remarkable fact. And the engine wasn't just technically clever, it was built to last. Owners reported covering enormous distances with minimal mechanical intervention. In an era when many cars demanded constant attention, when keeping a vehicle running was practically a second occupation, the 203 had a reputation for simply continuing, day after day, year after year. In the French countryside, where a mechanic might be an hour away and spare parts were not guaranteed, that reliability wasn't a selling point, it was a lifeline. There's something worth sitting with here. This car was designed by people who had just lived through 6 years of industrial war. Who understood, at a cellular level, what it meant for something to break down at the wrong moment? Who had watched supply chains collapse and machinery fail under impossible conditions? That experience is baked into every engineering decision in the 203. You can feel the seriousness of it, and commercially, the market felt it too. Orders came in steadily, production ramped up. Peugeot's Sochaux factory, rebuilt from bomb damage, began operating at a scale that would have seemed impossible just 4 years earlier. By any honest measure, the 203 was doing exactly what it was built to do. So why, within just a few years, would it start to disappear from the conversation entirely? The answer involves a rival, a completely different philosophy of what a car should be, and a moment in automotive history that changed everything about how the world looked at French engineering. October the 5th, 1955, the Paris Motor Show. If you were there that day, you witnessed something that had no real precedent in the history of the automobile. Citroën unveiled the DS, and the room stopped, not figuratively, literally. People stood in silence in front of that car, trying to understand what they were looking at. It had no visible door hinges. The roofline was a single, sweeping curve that seemed to belong to a decade that hadn't arrived yet. The suspension system used hydraulics to keep the car level, regardless of load or road surface. You could remove a wheel entirely and the car would hold itself up. It looked like something designed not by engineers, but by someone who had decided that the laws of conventional automobile design simply didn't apply to them. Citroën received something like 12,000 orders on the first day of the show alone. 12,000 orders in a single day. The motoring press lost its collective mind. Journalists who were supposed to be professionals ran out of measured language and started reaching for poetry. The DS wasn't just a new car. It was a statement that France was not merely recovering from the war, it was leaping past everything that existed before it. Now, here is the thing nobody says out loud when they tell this story. The Citroën DS was genuinely brilliant. This is not in dispute. But it was also extraordinarily expensive to maintain. Its hydraulic system, which gave it that supernatural ride quality, required specialist knowledge to service. A small leak in the wrong place could leave you stranded in a way that no ordinary mechanic could fix roadside. Early models had reliability problems that Citroën took years to fully resolve. The Peugeot 203 had none of those problems, but the 203 also had none of the drama. And in the court of public attention, drama wins every time. Here is where the 203's fate was quietly sealed, not by failure, not by a recall, not by any engineering shortcoming, but by timing and by temperament. The world in 1955 was done being practical. It had been practical for a decade. It had rationed and rebuilt and made do and got on with things. Now it wanted to feel something. It wanted to be astonished. The Peugeot 203 was not in the business of astonishing people. It was in the business of getting them home safely through a rainstorm with a full boot and a healthy engine note. That year, Peugeot also launched the 403, a larger, more modern-looking car that shared some of the 203's engineering DNA, but wore it inside a body that felt genuinely fresh. The 403 was well received, and it would go on to achieve a kind of immortality that had nothing to do with its engineering. A British television series called Inspector Maigret, based on the famous detective novels by Georges Simenon, featured a Peugeot 403 as the detective's car throughout the 1960s. A generation of British viewers watched that 403 week after week. The car became inseparable from the character, from the atmosphere, from the mood. The 203 got no such moment, no famous detective, no television series, no cultural attachment that would burn its silhouette into collective memory. It stayed in production until 1960, quietly, efficiently, doing exactly what it was designed to do, and then it stopped. And here is the part of this story that should make you genuinely uncomfortable, because it's not really about a car anymore. Think about what actually survives in history. Think carefully about it. It is rarely the thing that worked best. It is rarely the most honest solution to the most real problem. What survives is the thing that attached itself to a feeling, to a moment, to a story that people wanted to keep telling long after the original event was over. The Peugeot 203 worked. Genuinely, measurably, provably worked. 685,000 units produced over 12 years. Families across France, Belgium, Switzerland, and beyond used that car to rebuild their lives after the most destructive conflict in human history. Farmers, doctors, teachers, small business owners who needed something that would start on a cold morning and still be running 10 years later without demanding constant expensive attention. That is not a small thing. That is an enormous thing. And yet the 203 is not in the conversation. It is not the car people point to when they talk about the golden age of French engineering. It does not appear on the short lists. It does not generate the auction room excitement. It does not make grown men emotional at classic car gatherings the way a DS does, or a Jaguar E-Type, or a Ferrari from that same era, because those cars had stories wrapped around them. Visible, dramatic, emotionally charged stories. The DS had the Paris Motor Show moment. The E-Type had Enzo Ferrari calling it the most beautiful car ever made. A quote that has been repeated so many times, it has become part of the car's actual structure. These machines became symbols. The 203 remained a tool. And here is the uncomfortable parallel that this story is really building toward. How many things in your own life worked perfectly and were forgotten anyway? How many decisions you made, careful, considered, genuinely correct decisions, disappeared without recognition because you made them quietly, because you didn't attach a story to them, because you solved the problem and moved on without making sure anyone understood what the problem actually was. The men who engineered the Peugeot 203 were serious people solving serious problems in serious times. They were not interested in spectacle. They were interested in getting it right. And they got it right, completely right. And history filed it under adequate and moved on. That should bother you, not just as a car enthusiast, as a person who has spent decades watching how the world actually works. Before we get to what this story really means, and there is a final layer here that most people never reach, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. We cover stories like this one because they matter. Because the things history forgot are often the things most worth understanding. Hit subscribe, leave a comment, telling us what this car reminds you of from your own life or your own memory, And if this kind of content means something to you, share it with someone who would appreciate it. It costs nothing, and it keeps this conversation going. Now, back to the 203. Because the final chapter of this story has a detail that almost nobody mentions, and once you hear it, you'll understand exactly why this car was always going to be forgotten, and why that was never actually its fault. Here is the detail, the one that closes everything. The Peugeot 203 was not forgotten because it was replaced by something better. It was forgotten because it was replaced by something louder. And those are not the same thing. The 403 that came after it used the same basic engineering principles, the same commitment to reliability, the same honest relationship between what the car promised and what it delivered. Peugeot did not suddenly discover a better way to build cars in 1955. They discovered a better way to present them. A slightly longer body, a slightly more modern roofline, a name that sounded like progress. The 203 didn't disappear because it failed the test. It disappeared because it passed it too completely, too early, and too quietly to leave a scar. And that is the real lesson buried inside this story. We live in a world, and you have lived long enough to have watched this accelerate, where the thing that gets remembered is the thing that made the most noise at the right moment. The DS made noise, the E-Type made noise. The muscle cars of the 1960s made noise that you could feel in your chest from 3 streets away. These machines were engineered to create an emotional event, and emotional events get remembered. The 203 was engineered to be invisible when it was working, like good plumbing, like a well-built bridge, like a doctor who gives you the right diagnosis the first time without any drama. You only notice those things when they're gone. There are 685,000 reasons to remember the Peugeot 203. 685,000 families who got to the other side of post-war Europe partly because this car existed and worked exactly as promised. That is a legacy, a real one, built in metal and rubber and honest engineering by people who had survived the worst and decided to build something that would last. History didn't give it a monument, so we're giving it one here, 12 minutes at a time, in conversations like this one, with people who are old enough to know the difference between what glitters and what endures. If this story meant something to you, and I believe it did, then do something simple. Subscribe to this channel right now. We are building something here for people who want the real history, not the highlight reel version. Leave a comment below telling us what the Peugeot 203 reminds you of. A car you once owned, a decision you made that worked perfectly, but nobody noticed. A person in your life who deserved more recognition than they ever received. And if you know someone who would appreciate this kind of story, a friend, a son, a fellow enthusiast, share this video with them today. The 203 never got the recognition it earned. Make sure the people around you don't have the same problem.